Hi folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here. In this tutorial, I'd like to walk you through the new features found in Trapcode Particular 3.0. The first thing you're going to notice is that Particular is now in a different category. Instead of being in Trapcode, it's in RG Trapcode, and inside here, we'll locate Particular. I'd like to begin by jumping into the Designer window, which I'll do by clicking on this bright blue button here at the top and launching the Designer. Now, this window serves a lot of different functions. First, you might notice it provides a playback window for your particle settings. Over on the left, it hosts a number of presets that either ship the plugin or are your own custom presets. Over here on the right, it shows the related parameters to any of the blocks that I have selected down here. These blocks give you a visual indication as to what's going on with the hundreds of parameters back in the actual Particular plugin. And we've divided these blocks up into categories that directly correspond to the categories within Particular, such as the emitter section, the particle section, shading, physics, and aux system. If I click on the motion block, it shows me the parameters related to the motion, such as the velocity of the particles at the time they're born, the randomness of the velocity, how that velocity is inherited from the movement of the emitter, that kind of stuff. So as you go through and design and make changes, such as color changes, over life changes, such as opacity over life, the blend mode of the particle, you can quickly navigate around between different sections and see exactly what your settings look like as they play back. You'll notice that the sections over here, such as shading, physics, and aux system, I haven't changed yet, so these are all grayed out. If I change the gravity, let's say I set this to a positive gravity and make the particles accelerate downward, this block now activates and shows me that gravity is in use. I'm going to go up here and reset this for now. Now here's where it gets really interesting, because in the over 10 years that Particular has been around, everything you've done with one instance of the plugin is represented right here. So in other words, you apply a copy of the plugin, you get one particle system. If you want more than one particle system, you apply another copy of the plugin. And you work back and forth between different copies of the plugin that are disconnected, do not share settings, and are not within the same unified 3D space. Particular 3.0 is no longer limited to one particle system. You can have up to 8 different systems within one instance of the plugin. These particle systems can either have their own independent settings, or they can inherit settings from the master system. So this means as you design within Particular, you can devote an entire system to something very subtle, such as very small dusty particles or sort of an inner core glow. So I'd like to show you some examples of this. I'm going to delete some of these extra systems here. To make a new system, I can simply click on the plus and add a system with its default settings. Or if I undo that, I can click on this menu here and select Duplicate System, and this will make a clone of that system with identical settings right down to the random seed in the motion block. This is really handy if I want to take this and perhaps have the same settings with the same size, same fade out curve, but perhaps I want to change the color. Now, I mentioned that when I duplicate these use the exact same random seed. So I'm going to make sure to go to the motion block here and adjust this random seed. Now you can see that I've got orange and purple particles existing in the same unified 3D space. I mentioned systems can inherit settings from the master system. So when I go to the gravity here and I turn this up, now first the purple particles in the master system are going to be using that gravity. This system 2 has its own gravity definition, which is off. If I remove that gravity block, this is now going to be inheriting the gravity from the master system. When we don't have a block defined in a system that isn't the master, it will inherit that setting from the master. This includes things like particle type. So if I remove the particle type, go to the master system and change this to something like a glow sphere. So I've got 2 systems defined by one particle type, 2 different color maps, and sharing the same physics settings. If I go to system 2, remove the size block, I can go to the size of the master and turn this down so that these are both very small. Now I mentioned making sort of an inner glow core. Now I could make a new system and do this from scratch, but there's some presets that allow you to do this quite quickly. And this is where I get to talking about the different types of presets. Being that Particular is now a multi-system particle generator, we can save presets that include all of the systems as one preset. This is what we call a multi-system preset. Anytime I load any of these, Say I load this one right here. This is 3 different particle systems. This particular one is actually using 3 systems that share the same settings, but each of them is red, green, and blue, and they have very slightly different physics settings in each system. I'm going to undo that and go back to my previous settings. I mentioned adding a glow core to this. So rather than loading a new multi-system preset, I'm simply going to load a single system preset. And that is this tab right here. So if I load any of these, this is simply a single chain for one single system. Now, you have to be careful when you do this. Let's say if I go to the light and magic category, and there's this one called basic magic right here. If I click on this, it's going to load it into the current system, which kind of works, but it erased that orange particle system that I had. I'm going to undo. I could either add a new system and select that preset of basic magic, and now I've got 3 systems with independent settings. Or I could also just use a modifier key. So if I go back to the single system presets, hold down Alt or Option, click on Basic Magic, it will add a new system and apply the single system preset right to my settings. I'm going to make these particles just a little bit smaller and go to the emitter type and increase the number of particles that are emitting from both system 1, from both the main system, and I'll actually just remove the emitter block from system 2 so it's sharing the same particle settings. I'm also going to remove the air and bounce and go into the master turbulence field and just add a little bit of turbulence to the movement of the particles. I like to use a trailing scale as well, so I'm going to go into the size block here and also have these trail off in their size. I also mentioned using particles to do very subtle things, so I can add a new system here. I'm going to make these particles really small, so I'll set these to 1. Make the size randomness 100%, so they'll be even smaller than 1 or a little bit bigger than 1. I'll have them also scale over time. And I'm going to go to the emitter block here and just turn this up. And what this will do is add a level of detail in there. As I move this around, there is some very small wispy particles that are filling things in. And I can turn this up pretty high. Let's say I want this to about 8,000 particles, and I'll set this to a little bit more of an orange, and I'll go to the particle and I'll set its blend mode to screen. So let's say I wanted to add a streaklet to this one. Now, what I haven't talked about are the preset blocks. There's preset color maps, preset opacity curves, preset particle types, so it can quickly just add any of the preset particle types, such as a glow sphere or a streaklet. And there's also a massive sprite library available to you, and I'll get to that in just a second. I'm going to close this up. I'm going to use this particle type, which is the streaklet, and for this, I don't want any motion at all, so I'm going to crank up the size so we can see it. And I want to zero out its motion. In fact, I'm just going to look at the streaklet. So I'm going to isolate it by option clicking on the eyeball right here, and this will solo that system. I'm just looking at that streaklet layer. So I can zero out its motion by going to the motion and zeroing things out, but there's actually a very handy zero motion block preset right here. There we go. Now this is inheriting that gravity from the master system. I probably don't want that. So I'm going to go to the physics section, click on that, and I'll just add the default gravity setting, which is off. There, I might want just a little bit of velocity from motion. I'll set this to maybe 1 or 2%. Should be, probably need to raise the particles per second to fill in those gaps to make a nice smooth streak. And let's set the color to something a little more golden, and I'll set the blend mode of it to screen. These are lasting quite a bit of time, so I'll set the particle lifespan to ½ a second, and let's have these scale out over time. There we go. So a little streaklet trail as system number 5. In fact, let's take this one. I'll switch over to a Bezier curve and drag this first point down so we get a scale up and down over time. If I like what I've done so far, I can go down to the bottom, click on Save. Save that as a preset, and this will show up in the multi-system presets section down at the bottom under custom, and there it is. If I'd like to save this single system as a preset, let's say I want to save this streaklet trail, I can save this under the single system presets. And then I've got that single system retrievable at any time that I can add to my design. That shows up over here under single system presets, custom, and then there it is, streaklet trail. Now there's so much more that I haven't even talked about, so I'm going to move quickly and talk about some of the other amazing new features. New to Particular 3.0 is the ability to use OBJs as emitter objects. So if you go to the emitter type here in the blocks, you'll see that we have all the basic default settings of the box, grid, light emitters, sphere, and one of these is an OBJ emitter. Now, when I load this in, keep in mind that the default velocity is 100. You're not going to see a very defined shape until you lower this velocity down to almost 0. If you'd like to change the OBJ that you're using, make sure you've got the emitter type block selected. Go over to the parameters and select Choose OBJ. And this will load the OBJ library that ships with Particular 3.0. There's a number of primitives in here, as well as some objects provided by our good friends at Pixel Lab. You can size up the OBJ either by XYZ linked, or you can actually freely distort it in XYZ as well. That doesn't work well for objects like this, but if you're using something like this sine wave here, I can freely distort this if I set this to XYZ individual. Distorting OBJs via XYZ individual is sometimes actually fairly useful. I'll change this one more time, set this back to XYZ linked, and scale this down. One thing to take note of is that you can emit from the vertices of the OBJ, the edges, the faces of the OBJ, as well as the volume inside the 3D model. So far, just about everything I've been showing you has been inside the designer window. Now, many of you are very comfortable working out here in the effects controls if you've been using Particular for quite a while. So I wanted to take a moment and jump back into the effects controls and show the different options that you'll find in here, because again, a few things have changed. So if you'd like to work with multiple systems right here in the effects controls, you can enable and disable your systems right here. Let me load a preset that is multi-system enabled. Perhaps a multi-system explosion. As you can see, this uses 4 different systems, and I can turn the visibility on and off of each individual system. And just like in the designer, I can Option or Alt-click on a system to solo it. Now, so far I've shown you how to browse different OBJs when you're using OBJ emitters. Particular also has the ability to use custom layers as particle types, and we call these either sprites if they're 2-dimensional and always facing the camera, or textured polygons if they are 2-dimensional but are able to rotate in all 3 axes. In this preset right here, we have some pre-made fire clips that are looping and assigned to each particle. If I go to the particle section right here, we'll see that the particle type is set to sprite. Now, you can browse these in the designer, but if you'd like to browse the sprite library directly within the effects controls, you can click right here and choose sprite, and you will get access to the sprite library that ships with Trapcode Particular. Let's say I wanted to change it to Fire Explosion 2. That will switch it out. I can solo that to see that it is now using the different sprite. If I go and load a preset that's using an OBJ, this one right here, this is using an OBJ emitter with lots of different aux particles. I'll hit apply. So just like with the sprites, I can go to the emitter section. We see that it's set to OBJ model, and right here I have choose OBJ, and I can swap out the different types of OBJs that ship with Particular, or you can add your own using the add new OBJ option right here. So we've made the effects controls as flexible as we possibly can to allow you access to many of the things you see in the designer without having to bounce back and forth between the designer if you prefer to work in the effects controls. But I'd like to jump back and talk about those OBJ and sprite libraries just a little bit. So if I double click this emitter block right here, this is going to pull up the different presets that we've got. And remember I mentioned we have, the default emitters and box emitters, grid and spherical emitters and all that. And we have a default OBJ emitter type right here. But another way to load an OBJ emitter quite quickly, rather than going to select OBJ emitter and then go into the OBJ library, we've actually preloaded a lot of these blocks for you already. So if I, again, double click on this, and just below the emitter type, you'll see an OBJ section. And these are actual preset blocks, and it will actually load the block preset right into the emitter section, rather than browsing the OBJ media directly. What this does is set the OBJ type as well as the particles per second and the emitter size and all that kind of stuff. So it just comes predefined with that, just to save you a few clicks. Now the same thing goes for sprites. I'm going to click reset here, and I'll go to the particle type. And rather than using the preset sprite or texture polygon, I have a number of these sprites already defined in here. So you can just do a single click and it will load it immediately. Now the benefit in doing this is that it will have the proper time sampling, if it needs to be a random loop, if the unmult status needs to be on or off, depending on the type of particle, if it's merged on black, as well as the blend mode, if it's appropriate for that type of particle. So these blocks are just a time saver for you. They're there in the cases where there are specific things that need to be defined in either the time sampling and or unmult status and or blending mode. You'll notice that not every single sprite in the library has its own custom block. In the case of most of these still frames, you can simply load these using the default settings and they will work just fine. We don't need any custom blend mode or unmult status or time sampling options for any of these still frames. One of the big things we've done is overhaul the aux system. Previously, you were quite limited in the way you could control your particles. It could either inherit from the main particle or it could use some of the preset particle types. We've now added the ability to actually add custom sprites for your aux particle that are independent from the main particle. This is actually a pretty big deal. Also, back in the effects controls under the aux system, you'll notice a lot of the parameters that were not keyframeable over time are now keyframeable, such as the particles per second. Even the size and or opacity over life graphs are animatable over time. So if I set this to one graph here and flip it around, and it will make a keyframe for that. And you'll notice as you step through time, it's actually going to interpolate the size over life graph or opacity over life graph. I'd like to talk about one last rendering option you'll find in Particular 3. This is available both in the designer window that I'm in right now, as well as back in After Effects. Down in the lower right of your designer, you'll see a little cogwheel. This is going to bring up a preferences window. And inside the preferences, you're going to see a couple different acceleration options. The first option is called CPU. This renders everything on your computer's CPU. And this is everything. So all the particle point calculations, all of the physics simulations, such as gravity and wind, the aux system calculations, as well as the actual particle rendering itself. So rendering the image of the particle, rendering its blend mode against the other particles, sorting it in Z-space, motion blur, depth of field, all that kind of stuff. So the actual rendering of the particle has always happened on the CPU, as well as all the point calculations. So if I enable GPU, we're going to see that we can enable GPU particle rendering. So that process of rendering the particle, sorting it, blending it, all that kind of stuff now can be pushed over to the GPU. Now I want to preface this by saying that CPU and GPU acceleration are yet another tool that you have in particular to get your work done. It's really going to be up to you to experiment with your CPU and GPU setups in terms of what you're doing, the types of particles you're using, the size of the particles per second, because we've seen radical differences, and I mean radical differences from one CPU to another, one GPU to another, as well as what you're actually doing in particular. And we've seen very modest speed increases from the CPU all the way up to a 36x boost in rendering. As you work with Particular and you do your amazing designs, you really should experiment with CPU or GPU to see what works best for your current setup. So I'd like to show you one example where this is really going to show a huge difference in CPU versus GPU. Now, as you well know, if you've used Particular in the past, that a good way to bog down Particular is to increase the particle count. Another good way to slow down Particular on the CPU is to use a really large particle type, especially a sprite. Now, right now, I'm running a modest 200 particles per second, and in general, the CPU can do a pretty good job holding up, but it's bound to run into some limitations. So this is 200 particles per second. I'm actually going to set this to 2,000 particles per second. Now, just to explain the differences here, we have two GPU modes. We have one that's called direct and one that's called streaming. The short story is streaming is much, much faster. It renders things in batches, but in the process of spreading the rendering across your GPU and rendering things in batches, some things are just not possible in streaming mode, at least not possible in a reliable way. One thing is mixed blend modes. Another is sprites that change over time, such as QuickTime movies. So in this case, I'm using a particle that's a sprite. So this is definitely eligible for streaming, but first I'd just like to demonstrate direct. Direct is going to be pretty much on par with the CPU. It is not rendering things in batches. It is not using your graphics card very efficiently at all, but it does properly sort things in Z-space, and it does allow for things like QuickTime movies, as well as mixed blend modes. But as you can see, we're not getting the dramatic speed increases that you might expect with GPU rendering. So next I'll kick it over to GPU streaming. Now immediately you'll see that we have a much more interactive environment. It's doing a remarkable job spreading out the rendering over your GPU. If, however, you request something that is not possible on streaming, it is actually going to kick it back to direct mode for you. So let's say I duplicate this system, go to the particle, and set the blend mode to lighten. So I have two different blend modes on two different systems here. GPU streaming is not going to like this. It's going to kick it right back to direct mode for you. So if I go to the master system, you'll see right here, GPU direct. And if I try to force it back to CPU, it's actually going to tell you that it cannot do that because you're using a mixture of blend modes. Another time you're going to see this is using QuickTime movies. So let's go to system 2, to the particle, choose the sprite here, and we'll go into load a fire loop. I'll hit apply. And let's go back to the master system. We'll see that, again, it's in direct. If I kick it over to streaming, it is going to tell us that streaming is not supported. The footage is a particle texture that is animated over time, such as a movie. So those are cases where you'd want to use direct. And again, like I said before, the rendering difference you're going to see between CPU and GPU is really going to depend on your setup. Personally, on my Mac Pro, I have a very, very fast CPU. So sometimes I see a very little difference between CPU and GPU direct. But again, experiment with your own personal computer and use it as one of many tools you have available to you in Trapcode particular. So that about covers all the amazing things that you're going to find in Particular 3. It's a fantastic update to an already amazing plugin. The changes that we've made in version 3 are really going to change everything about how you work with Particular. So I encourage you to go play and experiment with this amazing new piece of software. My name is Harry Frank. We'll see you next time.